Good evening. If you got a Bible with you, I'd recommend turning to Genesis 37. That's where we're going to get started in our sermon for this evening. Faith of Our Fathers is a good song. I don't know if you all have thought about that all too much, especially the claim, the request really to God, that it would be a sweet thing if the children's generation would go through the same difficulties and even the same hardship and death as the father's generation. We think about our fathers, spiritual fathers. I think about people like Stephen, the first martyr. I think about people like the apostles who all gave their lives in the service of God. And yes, I think about people like Joseph from Genesis 37, a man who is dedicated towards God. And yet, how do we know that? Because he sticks with God even though he goes through problem after problem after problem. Tonight, we're going to do a quick survey, as quick as one can make it, of Joseph's life, of his early years at least, and see a lot of his character as we're going through the first section of his life. In the scripture reading for this week, Thursdays and Fridays covered Genesis 37 through 41. So that's the section that I'll be preaching on. Joseph isn't addressed in chapter 38. So we'll leave that for a different time. And instead, we'll look at his story as it progresses in the way that it does. One thing that you see that's interesting about Joseph, and why I like Joseph so much as a person, as a character, is that he is one of the few individuals in the Bible where, at least to my reading, I see him as a perfect individual. Different people read Joseph's story in different ways. Sometimes there are a couple of problems that people might point to and say that that is him being faithless or him walking away from God or whatever. I don't agree with that. And so whatever I say tonight is going to be colored in such a light. I think that the scripture actually portrays Joseph as one of those people who really doesn't do anything wrong. Right in league with Daniel, right in league with Nehemiah. People who, according to the scriptural text, did everything right and were examples, prime examples, of what faith in God ought to look like. And so, as we look at Joseph, as you look at his life story, even in this first little snippet of his life story, you get to see certain patterns develop. You get to see his faithfulness through all of it. That's what we'll do tonight. We're going to read a lot of the text. I'll try to keep my commentary on it to relatively minimum and just let the text talk to you and show you what it has because God has inbuilt some patterns in here that are important for us to recognize. Historically, Abraham has had his son Isaac. Isaac has had his son Jacob and Esau. Jacob cheated Esau out of a blessing. Mike preached a sermon on that this morning. Not going to go back into that. God uses imperfect people like Jacob and passes the holy line down through him and through his 12 sons. One of them is Joseph. But Jacob had a history of not being so righteous in his past. And so the consequences of that follow him, unfortunately, even into his new family. And just like his father and mother had favorites and chose him or Esau and it split the family, so too does Jacob have a favorite. And it's Joseph. And it's his favoritism that engenders hatred between Joseph and his brothers. That's where we pick up. As you start reading in Genesis 37, look at verse 1, and we'll just read a large section of this chapter. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a robe of many colors for him. When his brothers saw that their father hated or loved him more than all the brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. Then Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us?" The brothers asked him, "Are you really going to rule us?" So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. "Look," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He told his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him. "What kind of dream is this that you have had?" He said, "Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers, are pasturing the flocks at Shechem. Get ready. I'm sending you to them." Joseph replied, "I'm ready." Then Israel said to him, "Go and see how your brothers and the flocks are doing and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the Hebron Valley, and he went to Shechem. While he's at Shechem, Joseph does not find his brothers. In fact, he finds another man, an unnamed man. We don't know who it is. And that man points out to Joseph, "Your brothers aren't here, they're somewhere else." Joseph already has a track record of bringing back unfavorable reports about his brothers' operations. And now he finds his brothers not where they promised to be, somewhere else. So is it any wonder that they know that he's going to make trouble for them? When he goes down to Dothan to find the brothers, they see him in verse 18. They see him in the distance, and before he had reached him, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, "Oh, look, here comes that dreamer. So now, come on, let's kill him. Throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him. Then we'll see what becomes of those dreams." And when Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let's not take his life." Reuben also said to them, "Don't shed blood. Throw him into a pit in this wilderness. Don't lay a hand on him." He intended to rescue him from them and return him to his father. And so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off his robe, that robe of many colors he had on. They took him, they threw him in a pit. The pit was empty without water. They sat down to eat a meal. And then they saw some Ishmaelite traders on their way to Egypt. And Judah, who is an ever enterprising sort, realized, if we kill him, we just waste him. And so they sold him for some pocket change, took his robe, covered it in blood, returned it to Jacob, their father, and said, "Whose is this?" And he thought his son was dead. That's the first arc in Joseph's story. That's the first section of what Joseph goes through. And what you see in this, and what I hope to show you, is that there is a pattern developed inside of this first story. The first thing that you see in this chapter is that Joseph shows himself to be responsible. This is going to happen again and again, so keep these things in mind. In verse 2, Joseph is out working. He's working with his brothers, or his half-brothers, sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, and he brings a bad report. He reports in on them and says, "Hey, they weren't doing something that was okay. They were going against your will, or they weren't fulfilling it in some way." He shows himself to be the responsible one, and so he's the one who's elected to kind of be the manager of them. His father later sends him to check on his brothers and bring back those reports. His father trusts him. This is a theme that will be established. Everyone Joseph works for trusts him because of the work that he does. The second thing that you see is there's a natural result of that. Joseph is responsible, and some people like it and some people don't. In this case, verses 3 and 4 show you that stark contrast. You have Israel, who loves him more than all the brothers, and you have the other brothers who hate him more than anything. Hate him enough they're willing to kill him at the first sign of him showing up somewhere they're allowed to. Their hatred for him is quite aggressive. You'll see this in varying degrees. The people that Joseph works for, they like him, but he always runs into trouble. Somebody does not care about him. The third thing that you see is that Joseph doesn't really care about who likes him and who doesn't like him. He goes on and he shares his God-given blessings with that group of people. In this instance, he shares his dreams with his brothers in verse 5 and in verse 9. He has a dream, he shares it with his brothers. They don't like it. So when he has another dream, he shares it with his brothers and his father. Some people read that as him being the annoying little brother who's trying to irritate his older siblings. I don't think it is that. He's seeing dreams from God, and he's sharing them with the people whom he's closest to, or at least he wants to be. But it doesn't change their mind, and in fact, it only makes things worse for him. And then you have the fourth step, which is that sharing has consequences. His father keeps the matter in mind, and we'll see it fulfilled one day later on. But his brothers, when they go to kill him, when they're so upset with him in verse 19, what do they say? They say, "Look, here comes that dreamer. That guy with the dreams. We hate him for those. Let's kill him and see what comes of them." His sharing of God's blessings, his sharing of the dreams and the visions that God had given him directly lead to his downfall in this instance. And so the question we're left with at the end of the story is, how will Joseph respond? What will he do? Will he continue down this path of responsibility and down the path of sharing God's things with others, or will he turn around? Will he forget those things, and will he become a selfish individual who is not willing to help others? If you've ever been given blessings from God and shared those with other people and then they rejected you for it, you probably can, feel similar to Joseph. Are you inclined to help that person again when that person has shown rudeness, unkindness, have rejected you in return? Probably not. And so Joseph is given this question, and he goes off down to Egypt thanks to his brothers and their aggression. And so we find him in Egypt in chapter 39. And in chapter 39, in verse 1, it says Joseph has been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, he bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. And here's where you see the pattern start again. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. And from that time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He didn't concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Joseph becomes a slave in Egypt. He is bought by a man named Potiphar, and he shows himself to be a responsible slave, even though he is a slave. The Lord is with Joseph, quickly establishing him to be the best of the slaves, and so Potiphar loves him and appoints him to a high position, the highest position, to rule the entire household. Joseph continues to share those blessings with Potiphar. And as a result of Joseph's work, the Lord blesses everything in the house, outside the house, in the fields, everything that Potiphar has. God extends his blessings on them because of Joseph's work. But somebody doesn't like him. And you find that out in the end of verse 6. It says that Joseph was well built and handsome. And after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. And he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you because you are his wife. So then, how could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?" She spoke to Joseph day after day, and yet he refused to lie with her. Now, one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought the Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could lie with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. When he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran." When Potiphar finds out, he's not very happy. And so he condemns Joseph to the prison. Here you see someone who didn't like Joseph very much, looked at his success, was impressed by it, tried to manipulate him into doing evil, and when he wouldn't, when he was too righteous, she accused him instead. A false allegation. He didn't do anything, and yet she accuses him of it, and so his sharing, his success, has consequences. Despite all the good he did for Potiphar, he still ends up in the prison. How do you think Joseph would respond to that situation? Have you ever been in a situation where you were tempted to do something that was evil, maybe even by another person? They were trying to pull you away and pull you into sin, and you said no. You stood up for what was right. You decided to do what was righteous. And as a result, you face consequences for that and get taken down a peg or two, even though you did the right thing. Physical consequences don't always align. And sometimes it gets you in a place you don't really enjoy. Do you continue being righteous? Do you feel motivated to continue doing the right thing? Do you feel motivated to continue being God's? Or do you say, well, obviously, he doesn't really care if you let me face this? It's the situation Joseph's in. So, how does he respond? You get to see it in chapter 39 and verse 21, and you see it, the cycle repeat once again. But the Lord was with Joseph. He extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden, and the warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden didn't bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful. Still steps up, serves in the prison, and once again, someone sees the value in him. The prison warden appoints him second in command of the prison, and now he runs all of the inter-prison affairs. And it continues in chapter 40 in verse 1. Even after this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker, they offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the cupbearer and the chief baker. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guards, in the very prison where Joseph was confined. Now the captain of the guards assigned Joseph to them as their personal attendant, and they were in custody for some time. Here you have VIPs, very important prisoners, as it were, and they're assigned to Joseph because Joseph's the one who's going to take the best care of them. Joseph has established this reputation. The warden knows they're in good hands, and so he leaves them with him, and Joseph gets an opportunity to share God's blessings with them. Verse 5, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker, who were confined in the prison, they each had a dream. Both had a dream on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We had dreams," they said to him, "but there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And so he's given the dreams. The cupbearer dreamed 3 bunches of grapes squeezed out into a cup and handed to Pharaoh. Joseph says, "That is excellent. Here's the interpretation. In 3 days, you will be returned to your former position and be his cupbearer once again. But," in verse 14, "when all goes well with you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me and mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this prison. I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon." He gives this man hope with one simple request. Remember that I helped you. Remember that I was here. Remember that I took care of you. We're going to see that that doesn't go so well in just a moment. The baker sees that the interpretation is positive, and so he gives his dream to Joseph. "I had 3 baskets of bread I was carrying them, and then all the birds ate all the bread." And Joseph says, "Well, in 3 days you will also leave the prison, but not to be restored to your position. Instead, you will be impaled or hanged, if you prefer that one." And in 3 days, on the 3rd day, verse 20, it was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and that man placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But Pharaoh hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had explained. And the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. I don't know if that qualifies as hatred, so you can take some issue with this list if you would like to. But think about it. Joseph has helped this man who was destitute. He was stripped of his position, maybe justifiably so, maybe not. Maybe Pharaoh's making a big deal out of nothing. He's been thrown in prison. He's at Pharaoh's mercy. He doesn't know what the answer is. He gets a confusing dream. He knows it means something, but can't figure out what it means. And so he goes to Joseph. Joseph cares enough to notice that something is wrong. And Joseph cares enough to go ahead and interpret the dream for him. It is favorable. He will return to his position. He will have everything that's good. And then there's a simple request. Remember me. Remember that somebody took pity on you. Remember that somebody helped you. And as soon as the chief cupbearer gets out, he forgets. And it's not for a day. And it's not for a week. It's not like he comes around a month later and remembers that Joseph helped him in chapter 41 and verse 1 at the end of 2 full years. Pharaoh has a dream. He's standing beside a Nile. He sees 7 well-fed cows. He sees 7 poorly fed cows. The well-fed cows are eaten by the poorly fed cows, but they're still poorly fed. He has another dream, same picture. Ears of grain of some sort. They get eaten. The good ones get eaten by the bad. And he's confused. He doesn't know what's happening. And so he summons all the magicians and all the wise men, tells them the dreams, and no one can interpret. Verse 8. We'll see a very similar situation happen in Daniel 2 and in Daniel 4. A foreign king has a dream from God, doesn't know what it means, and so calls upon the Hebrews to help. And this is when he remembers. Verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. And the baker and I had dreams on the same night. Each of the dreams had its own meaning. But there was a young Hebrew there, a slave of the captain of the guards. He was with us. He told us our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each one had its own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them. I was restored to my position, but the other man was hanged. And so 2 full years later, finally, Joseph sees some amount of success. Pharaoh calls him to himself. Joseph changes his clothes, goes to Pharaoh. He's very respectful about the whole thing. And Pharaoh says to Joseph in verse 15, I have had a dream. No one can interpret it. I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. What would you do if you were Joseph in that moment? How is your history with interpreting dreams? How is that gone for you? Told a dream to your brothers and it almost got you killed. It got you enslaved in a land far away. Now you've been in Egypt for, 10 years, something like that, a little over. It's been a while. And yet here you are. You interpreted the cupbearer's dream. I imagine he's in the room there with him. What has it gotten you? It got you 2 years in prison. And a friend who forgot that you existed. That's no friend at all. What has it gotten you up to this point to share God's blessings with other people? Maybe that's why Joseph says, I'm not able to. It's God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph says in verse 25, Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Here is the interpretation. The 7 good cows are the 7 good years. You'll have 7 good years before a 7-year famine, a time in which all your resources will be drained. But if you are wise in the 7 years, if you are wise before then, you can store up enough to save not only yourself, but everyone else in the lands around you. All of Joseph's sharing has brought him to this point. He was a son. He was the greatest of the sons. He became a slave. He was the greatest of the slaves. He became a prisoner. He's the greatest of the prisoners, and then he's forgotten and ignored for 2 years. All of Joseph's sharing, it's never gone well before. But what's his answer? God has given him a blessing and an ability, and it would not be right for him to hide that from other people. And so, come what may, whatever Pharaoh may say to this, maybe he'll listen, maybe he won't. Maybe he keeps Joseph out of prison, maybe he doesn't. Maybe Joseph goes back in there and is never brought out again. Who knows? But it's not for Joseph to question the result. All he can do is share the blessing that God has given him. And so he interprets the dream for Pharaoh. And so he speaks the truth to Pharaoh. And finally, he sees some amount of comfort. In verse 37, that proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to all his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this? A man in whom God's Spirit is?" And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands." Finally, at the end of this, after so many years of hardship and trouble, he's trying to do the right thing the whole time, and it never seems to generate physical success. It finally does. God has seen fit to allow him success in that instance. But the thing is, when you think about it, Joseph has had success. Because his real success is not being elevated to the highest place in Egypt. His success is serving the Lord. That's righteousness. His success is that he is consistently right with God. And so it doesn't matter whether he's one of the sons or one of the slaves or one of the prisoners. It doesn't matter where he's at because he's always serving the Lord. And that's the point. You see this pattern repeated over and over and over again. But in summary, there's just really one point to take away from it. Joseph always uses what he has to serve God and other people. That's it. That's who Joseph is. Why is he such a great character? Why is he such a great person? Why is he such a shining example of his faith? It's this: because he always serves God and other people. You see it reflected in his language. He's aware that his life is not about him. He's aware that the things he's doing and the stuff he's experiencing, it's not really, it doesn't end with the physical. It's not about this life here and now. It's not about the moment that he's living in. He knows that the Lord is with him. And so he pays his respect to God. In chapter 39, in verses 2 through 5, it talks about the Lord being with him. The Lord was with him. The Lord made everything he did prosperous. And then when he's tempted, in verses 8 and 9, what is his answer? His answer is, how could I do this great evil, and how could I sin against God? God's been with me the whole way. God's the one who's helping me here. How could I sin against him? How could I violate that relationship? You see it in chapter 40. He's told that the prisoners had dreams. We have dreams, there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph says, God can. God can help you. I can be the vessel for them. Don't interpretations belong to God? Then tell me your dreams. He knows that God is with him still, even in a prison. He knows that God is there. And so he gives God the credit and helps his fellow man. You see it in chapter 41. Pharaoh calls Joseph from the dungeon. Pharaoh says, I have a dream. No one can interpret it. You can interpret dreams. I've been told that you can do it. And Joseph says, no, I can't. But God can give you an answer. It's not about him. It's not about his physical circumstance. It's not about whatever is going on in his personal life. It's that God has revealed to Pharaoh what will happen, and God has revealed to Pharaoh the solution to it. And as much as I can, in whatever capacity I'm able, I will be a servant of God. And I will reveal those things of God which he has given to me to show to you. What you see in Joseph is you see a man who is selfless because he knows he has God's blessings and he has no right to hoard them. They are not his. They are not for his benefit. They are not for his comfort. They are God's. They are given to Joseph so that he can give them to others. I think that's why Joseph is so powerful. That's what I get out of his story. And even as you continue, as we'll continue a bit next week, you get to see some of these same ideas keep on propagating themselves. Selfless and giving, sacrificial to bless the other, not caring, not focusing about what's going on right now, but looking towards God and looking towards the spiritual and recognizing what he needs to do to be righteous before the Lord. Is that the kind of focus that you have in your life? Because we all go through some fairly tough circumstances. Maybe not slavery and imprisonment. Maybe not murderous intent from your siblings. Maybe not quite to the same degree. But God has seen fit that we all face some difficulties. What's your response to those? Is your response to open up and to bless others regardless? Is your response to give back to God, to always point towards him, to glorify him in how you think, in how you speak, in how you act? Or is your response to run from that, to close down and to shut yourself off, to run away? And maybe I don't have to be so gracious. Maybe since I was gracious in this moment and it didn't turn out for my comfort, maybe I won't do that again. What God shows is it's not about your life in the here and the now. It's about your life with him. It's about your relationship with God. And when you look after that, everything turns out all right in the end. Joseph eventually is blessed physically. Joseph eventually is brought out of his problem situations. But even if he wasn't, even if he was stuck in prison forever, he's still right with God. And so he still goes to heaven at the end of the day. That's the important thing. Is that your focus? Is that where you have angled yourself? Or are you a little bit too caught up in the circumstances and the here and now, and these things on earth are dragging you down and pulling you away from God? Be like Joseph. Focus yourself like him. Because at the end of the day, all that's important is your relationship with the Lord. If there's anything we can do to strengthen that relationship or to start that relationship if it's not going anywhere, ask us. What can we do? You can talk to me. I'll be standing right here as we all stand and sing the song together.